I am very pleased to be joined by William Darity Jr., an American economist and professor, as well as one of, if not the leading voice in the discussion for reparations, as well as the co-author of the book From Here to Equality, which I am also pleased to announce that I'll be giving away 5 copies of. They unfortunately won't be here until tomorrow morning. So let me know in the comments what your favorite timestamp is from the interview, and the first 5 people I'll reach out to send you a copy of the book. My members will have first dibs on that, but I want to say, Professor, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So I really want to tackle, I guess, some of the arguments or talking points you hear against reparations, as well as what reparations should look like. But could you start by just telling us what reparations mean? I know how they're given is a much more broad topic that I am interested in getting into, but maybe just like a general overview for people who aren't as aware or haven't really heard of the topic.
So, in our book, From Here to Equality, Kirsten Mullen and I define reparations generally as a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice or grievous injustices, plural. Um, and what we mean by each of those components is the following. First, acknowledgement is the admission and recognition on the part of the culpable party that they have committed serious harms and damages. But it also means that they make a commitment to engage in an act of restitution for those harms and damages, that they are going to attempt to compensate the community that's been victimized for the injuries that have been inflicted on them. And so that leads to the second component, which is redress, which is the act of restitution. This typically has taken the form where victimized communities are involved, typically has taken the form of some type of monetary compensation. And so restitution is essentially the compensatory act that's taken by the culpable party for the harms and damages that they have imposed on another community. And then the third component is closure, which is the coming to terms on the part of the culpable party and the victimized community to a stage at which they both agree that the debt has been paid, that the debt has been met satisfactorily and the account is closed. And the victimized community will then make no further claims on the culpable party unless there is a renewal of the atrocities or if a new set of atrocities take place. And so those are the three features that we identify of a reparations plan. And those are the three features that we think are generalizable to all reparations initiatives.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a great definition. Perfect way to put it for people maybe new to the subject. I do want to get into what they should look like and funding and things like that, but I think it might be more beneficial to start with some of the more common interjections you hear when you bring them up. I'm sure I have, so I'm positive you have as well. The most common one being, if no one alive was a slave or owned slaves, why should they get reparations or pay them? Could you speak to maybe some of the effects that are still being seen today?
So if we're talking about reparations that are specific to Black Americans, uh, one of the greatest errors that is typically made is to associate the case for reparations exclusively with slavery. And in fact, I think Kirsten Mullen and I get really disturbed when we hear people use the phrase slavery reparations. It is true. There's no one living today who has been exposed to American slavery as we understand it in the form of chattel slavery, nor is there anyone living today who has been an owner of human property under a regime of chattel slavery. However, there are many people living today who are descendants of the persons who were subjected to slavery and who are suffering the consequences of the impact of slavery and post-slavery atrocities on their lives in the present moment. And we argue quite fervently that if you would try to identify a summary measure that captured the cumulative intergenerational effects of white supremacy on living Black Americans, then you should use the racial wealth gap as that measure. And I want to be a little more specific about which Black Americans. In the work that we've done, our focus has been on Black Americans whose ancestors were enslaved in the United States. This is the community that has the claim on the United States government. And it's a claim that's associated with another event that took place after slavery ended, which was the failure of the government to fulfill its promise of the provision of 40-acre land grants to the newly emancipated persons, despite the fact that such a commitment had been made even during the course of the war itself.
Like you spoke to the government being the culpable party, I did want to get into kind of like what America's role was and sort of like you said, the historical policies that made them the culpable party.
Yeah. So I mentioned the fact that the federal government had made a commitment to the formerly enslaved to provide them with restitution for their years of bondage in the form of 40-acre land grants. And that's a promise that was not kept by the United States government. But at the same time, under the auspices of the Homestead Act of 1862, the federal government did provide 1.5 million white families with 160-acre land grants, 4 times the size of the 40 acres that were promised to the freedmen in the Western territories as the country completed its colonial settler project. And those 160-acre land grants were the foundation for a significant asset for those households that could have positive effects across generations. And in fact, Trina Williams-Shanks at the University of Michigan has estimated that 45 million living white Americans continue to be beneficiaries of the Homestead Act land patents. So that's the first set of policies that creates the wealth divide. And that's the distribution of land unevenly between Black and white Americans. The second set of policies really fall more fully under the category of the federal government having a significant degree of complicity. And this is the wave of upwards of 100 massacres that took place from the end of the Civil War to the beginning of World War II, in which not only were scores of Black Americans killed, murdered effectively, but also their personal property was seized and appropriated by the white terrorists and became the property of the white terrorists. And we're thinking here specifically of land and homes whose properties that were transferred to white hands as a consequence of these uprisings by white terrorists. And then in the 20th century, federal policy shifts away from focusing on land distribution as a mechanism for building assets to home ownership. And it does that in a highly discriminatory fashion, so that we have in the 20th century, in the aftermath of restrictive covenants that exclude Blacks from purchasing homes in particular neighborhoods, we have the phenomenon of redlining, which restricts Black access to credit for home purchases. And we have the introduction of the GI Bill, where in the aftermath of World War II, returning veterans were given public resources for the purposes of education, purchasing a home, purchasing a business. And the home buying supports, the business buying supports were structured in such a way that they were administered so that Black returning veterans were largely excluded from that benefit. So you built a white middle class out of the returning veterans from World War II through the use of the GI Bill, but you did not apply it equitably. And so, as a consequence, you did not build a black middle class out of the returning veterans from World War II. The final set of policies that I'll mention, although they're probably not the end of the list, but the final set of policies that I'll mention are associated with uh, urban renewal and the companion set of policies that were associated with building the federal highway system. In the process, Black neighborhoods, and in particular, Black-owned business districts, were absolutely destroyed throughout the entire United States, again, reducing Black wealth. So it's really federal policies that lie at the heart of the racial wealth gap. And so it is the federal government that should have responsibility for addressing that disparity.
One of the things you mentioned that I did want to maybe have you go into a little bit more, we speak about it on the channel, is redlining, just because that's something recent enough that you can still see the effects of, that still feels real to people. Could you maybe just, like, for people who aren't familiar with the term of redlining, just kind of describe what it is?
Yeah, redlining was a procedure whereby essentially maps were drawn that designated different portions of a city as being preferred sites for credit and less preferred sites for credit. And the least preferred sites were actually designated on the maps in red. So that's why people are referred to as redlining. And those were the areas that were most credit starved. The critical feature of those neighborhoods was that they were predominantly Black and they were products of active residential segregation. So you confine Black people to a particular set of neighborhoods, and then you designate those neighborhoods as sites that are not supposed to be eligible for any significant amount of credit. Uh, and so you're essentially destroying wealth or destroying wealth opportunities.
Yeah, and I think a large part of what goes into it, if I'm right, is like the better education opportunities were kind of kept away from those neighborhoods, like better jobs went in, and even when people from those neighborhoods would apply to jobs, that would be a way for the jobs to kind of know, oh, if they're from this neighborhood, they're most
Then
likely.
they're probably Black. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we won't give them the job. Yeah,
Yep.
that's exactly right.
Yeah, so and then speaking, I guess, about how reparations could be implemented, I know it's an open-ended question of sorts, as I know there's like multiple different ways or that get discussed, from cash payments. I've always leaned more towards massive community investments, because I feel like just making the cash payments, if the community is spending it at these corporations that are disproportionately white owned, it's hard to keep the cash in the community. So I wanted to ask you, you could go into the different ways that has been discussed about them being implemented, or the one that you think is the most beneficial, but how do you think that they should or could look?
In the work that we've done, we've argued that there should be four features of a reparations plan for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. And the first feature is establishing who's eligible to receive the funds. And we've argued that there should be two criteria that have to be met by any individual who is going to be participating in the reparations claim. And the first criteria is what we refer to as a lineage standard. And this means that an individual would have to demonstrate that they have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. And then the second criteria is the individual would have to meet an identity standard. So for at least 12 years before the adoption of a reparations plan or the adoption of a study commission for reparations, an individual would have to show that they self-classified as Black, Negro, African American, or Afro-American. So those are the two standards that we have in mind for eligibility. Now, the second feature of a reparations plan must be the determination of the amount. And the amount that we have in mind is calculated on the basis of the standard that I talked about a bit earlier, that captures the cumulative intergenerational effects of white supremacy, which is the racial wealth gap in the United States. The most recent data we have on the magnitude of that disparity is from the Survey of Consumer Finances, which is a survey conducted by the Federal Reserve. And the most recent version of that survey is data for the year 2022. Now, it was not released until October 2023, but nevertheless, it is now fully available to us and we can make use of it. And one of the key statistics that emerges from that survey is the fact that the average white household in the United States has $1.15 million more in net worth than the average black household. If you were to convert that into a per person estimate based upon the average size of a white household and the average size of a black household, it comes to a figure of approximately $400,000. We estimate very roughly that out of the 47 or 48 million Black Americans in the United States, about 40 million or so would be individuals who would have at least one ancestor who was enslaved here. And so if you multiply 40 million people by $400,000, you come up with a crude estimate of the total reparations bill of a figure in the vicinity of $16 trillion. So that's the amount. The third dimension of a reparations plan ought to be determination of who's responsible for paying for it. And we argue that it's the United States government that has responsibility for meeting the bill for two fundamental reasons. First reason is the federal government is the culpable party. It is the federal government that conducted and or sanctioned the policies that created and produced the racial wealth gap that we observe today. And I'll be glad to talk further about those historical policies a bit further in our conversation if you like. But that's the first reason that the federal government is the culpable party. The second reason is the federal government's the capable party. Unlike states and localities, the federal government is not constrained by tax revenues in making its decisions about massive expenditures. The constraint on government expenditures really is the potential of producing significant inflation. So if you can design your expenditure project, including a reparations project, appropriately, you could minimize the risk of inflation, and there would be no need to engage in any kind of tax increase for the purposes of financing the plan. So the federal government's the capable party because it does not have a budget constraint that is fixed by its tax revenues, unlike state and local governments. And state and local governments combined budgets, total combined budgets, amount to less than $5 trillion. And the size of the bill that I've described a moment ago is $16 trillion. So states and localities don't have the capacity to meet the task of eliminating the racial wealth gap. The final feature of a reparations plan should be determination of the form in which payments should take. And I'm going to depart with you a bit here because I'm absolutely convinced that the right way to do this is to make direct payments to eligible recipients and to make equal payments to each eligible recipient. That's precisely what has been done in the case of other victimized communities, whether it's the individuals who received monetary compensation from the German government for being subjected to the Holocaust, or it's the Japanese Americans who received monetary compensation from the US government as a consequence of their being subjected to mass incarceration during the course of World War II. Both of those instances, direct payments were made to the eligible recipients who had full discretion over the use of the funds. There was no third party, no intermediary. And I think that it's actually somewhat dangerous to set up a structure in which reparations payments are made to intermediaries or third parties.
Cool. And that might actually answer kind of what my next question was. It was going to be more of like what is the system of getting them paid, I guess. Would it be the government orchestrating these? I was going to ask if it would be like an independent agency. It seems like maybe you would just lean more towards the government directly giving the payments.
The Department of Treasury would have to have a unit that was charged with dispersing the reparations fund.
I did want to ask more looking forward with how polarized the government is now. It seems they're going after DEI, CRT, just basic like African American history, it seems. What do you think needs to be done or what work needs to be pushed forward to really bring reparations back to the mainstream to where it seems like I said, I mean, the conversation has shifted.
I actually, honestly, I think reparations is in mainstream conversation to the greatest degree it has been since the Reconstruction era. Mm-hmm. I'm actually kind of startled that the conversation that I think was most recently triggered in 2019 when there were some candidates for the presidency who actually endorsed reparations. I'm actually somewhat surprised that the conversation is continuing to this moment, including the fact that you invited me to come on your program to talk about it. I don't think that we would have had this level of engagement about reparations, say, only 10 years ago. I view that as a positive. Excuse me, I've got a cold. And
you're fine, no worries.
Occasionally I'm coughing. But I will say you're absolutely right that there's been a tremendous backlash lately. I think it's been precipitated by the active resuscitation of all of the principles of the Confederacy, reflected most dramatically in the invasion of the national capital on January 6, 2021. But at the same time, I think that backlash is a response in part to a significant change in attitudes among a large portion of the white population that is more predisposed towards the nation actually addressing its history of national injustice. For example, in the year 2000, a survey that was conducted by two researchers at the University of Chicago found only 4% of white Americans endorse monetary payments as reparations for Black Americans. A 2023 study conducted by researchers at the University of Massachusetts found that percentage had risen closer to 30. This is a significant change. I don't know if it's a change that can be sustained or translated into actionable policy, but it does hold promise.
I guess maybe I misspoke a bit in terms of mainstream. I just mean more so, what do you think needs to happen to make it, I guess, progress it forward in a way, so to speak? Is it just about getting Congress members elected that are willing to put this to vote? Is it about more like activism on the ground? What do you think?
I think it requires activism on the ground that can translate into transformation of who the representatives are in Congress so that we would have a legislative branch that would enact a reparations plan.
Yeah, awesome. So I think you covered a lot of the meat. We were trying to keep it under 30 minutes. So you did cover a lot of what I wanted to get to. I did want to give you a chance if you feel like there's anything that I've overlooked that you wanted to say. Feel free to shout out your book, things like that. The floor can be yours.
Well, actually, there are two books I'd like to shout out.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So one of them is the book that you're going to be sharing with your audience, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, which is the book that I wrote with Kirsten Mullen. But Kirsten and I also helped edit another volume, more recent volume, with Lucas Hubbard that's called The Black Reparations Project, a handbook for racial justice, which is in a collection of essays that were put together trying to explicate how you might do a reparations plan in great detail. And so I would think that if people are interested in this subject, that would also be a useful resource. Is there something else I'd like to add? Yes, I would like to mention that there is a growing body of activity, although I think it's perhaps overstated a bit, at the local level for the purposes of introducing so-called reparations plans at the local level. And I would say it's overstated a bit, because I think that the largest estimate of the number of attempts or initiatives of this type that I've been able to come up with thus far is somewhere in the vicinity of about 60 municipalities. And there are only 2 that have actively implemented actual projects. So we're talking about 58 that have talked about it or have a commission studying it or something along those lines. But there's more than 100,000 localities in the United States, so that's a very, very small share. But they've drawn a lot of attention because they appear to be the sites in which people are having some success. But I would argue that we need to be extremely cautious about claiming that these types of initiatives at the local level are actual reparations. And that's because these local initiatives are intrinsically going to be incomplete, inconsistent, and inequitable. They're going to be incomplete because states and localities in combination don't have sufficient resources to meet the bill of $16 trillion. They're going to be inconsistent because different locations are pursuing different plans in a fully uncoordinated manner, so that there's not going to be any kind of uniformity or significant integration of these programs among the places that have pursued them, which means in turn they will be inequitable, because what a person who is potentially an eligible recipient for reparations will get will be contingent on where they live. It will not be contingent on what they are merited or what they are due.
Yeah, so I guess anyone watching that is interested in the topic, William Darity Jr. is definitely the man to listen to read his works on the issue. I'll have both of the books that you mentioned in the description for anyone that wants to check them out. And guys, don't forget, From Here to Equality, I will be giving away 5 copies of, if you just leave what your best moment was from the interview, why you support reparations, something of the sort. And the first 5 comments I'll reach out to. My members do always get first dibs. I want to say again, thank you so much for taking the time to share some of your knowledge and experience with us.
Thanks so much for having giving me the time to talk to you.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
hope you enjoy the rest of your day.